In the pitch-black Kansas night, a horse's scream pierces through the smoking ashes. Beneath the scorched body of a wild mustang lies a newborn girl alive. Her eyes wide open, silent against the dark. War veteran Asher Collins stands, frozen hands trembling, eyes blurred with tears. He doesn't know if he's saving a child or being saved from his own haunted past. Subscribe now to catch more cinematic stories that will move your soul to its core. Under a sky heavy with ash-gray clouds, the Kansas prairie lay still and breathless. The air crackled with a strange tension, as if the land itself held its breath. Autumn had stripped the fields of color. The once golden plains were now bare, and gray skeletal stalks of corn snapping in the wind like brittle bones. The only sound was the eerie whistling of the wind weaving through fence posts and rusted barbed wire, carrying with it the scent of smoke, thick, acrid smoke. It was nearly midnight when the blaze rose on the horizon, just a flicker at first. Then a bloom of red licking the skyline like an unspoken warning. From the porch of his ramshackle farmhouse, Asher Collins squinted into the distance. He was a man molded by war both outside and within, grizzled, silent, tucked into a flannel shirt that still bore the faded patch of a long-gone infantry division. One eye half closed from an old explosion, the other sharp as a hawk's. He saw the fire registered its size and its direction and said nothing. He didn't say anything. He just stood the floorboards beneath him, creaking with age and weight and unspoken grief. Then he moved. Slowly, mechanically. He stepped down from the porch boots, crunching dried soil, and whistled a low, guttural tone. From the barn, an old mustang named Bishop emerged, already saddled. Asher had learned long ago never to leave the saddle off at night. War taught you to always be ready. He mounted Bishop and kicked into a gallop. The wind cut through the silence like a blade. Asher didn't need a flashlight. He knew the back trails like the lines of the hand he kept tucked in his jacket pocket. Scarred fingers stiff from frostbite suffered somewhere deep in Afghanistan. The fire was just past the East Ridge, where the highway cut a line through the wheat belt. He guessed a truck accident, maybe an overturned rig. Nothing unusual. This land devoured machines and men without hesitation. But then came the sound. It wasn't the crackle of flames or the distant sirens of volunteer fire trucks. It was sharper, thinner, more piercing. A cry. A human cry. He slowed. Bishop cocked his head. The wind bent around them, howling. Then it came again. Higher pitched, fragile, desperate. A baby. The breath caught in his throat. He kicked the horse harder. As he crested the final hill, the full scope of the destruction came into view. A semi had jackknifed across the median, its trailer split open like a tin can. Flames devoured the canvas siding, swallowing crates and cloth and bodies. Human bodies. Asher stopped short, dismounted. He approached slowly, boots crunching broken glass and charred bone. Smoke coiled like serpents around him. He pulled the bandana from his neck and tied it over his face. His eyes stung. The cry came again, closer now. He moved instinctively toward the sound, like a soldier drawn toward gunfire, not by bravery, but by something deeper, a memory maybe, or an obligation. Then he saw it, a patch of movement beneath the blackened skeleton of a canopy. Something gray and trembling. A horse, its body partially collapsed, belly scorched, legs twitching in the dirt. A wild mustang, ghostly in color ash, clinging to its mane. Beneath the animal's chest, curled impossibly tight against its body, was a bundle. He dropped to his knees. The full-sized bundle stirred. A scream, ragged and hoarse, erupted from within it. Asher reached with shaking hands and peeled back a scrap of burnt tarp. A baby. A girl. No more than a day old. Her skin was flushed, her lips parched, and yet her eyes like melted obsidian, locked onto his. He froze. His hand hovered uncertain. The horse groaned a sound of agony and defiance, and shuddered. Asher glanced down at it. Its eyes met his. There was no panic in them, only exhaustion. And something that looked eerily like trust. He bent low and reached under the horse's collapsed chest, sliding his arms around the infant. The heat from the animal's body clung to the child's skin. She whimpered, but did not resist. Asher pulled her free. As he rose, the horse let out one last breath, its massive rib cage rising and falling like a wave. Then stillness. Total, devastating stillness. Asher stood in the orange glow of the fire, the baby pressed against his chest. He was shaking. His shoulders hunched, not from fear or cold, but from something older, guilt maybe, or recognition. He looked back down at the horse. Its face was serene, A warrior's end. Protecting what could not protect itself. He whispered, "You did good." And then his eyes drifted to the child. He hadn't held a child in 17 years. Not since the night the adoption fell through. Not since his daughter drove into a river with a bottle of pills and a locked door. They said it wasn't his fault. But he knew better. He had been raised by silence and passed it on like a curse. His wife left the day after the funeral. His farm turned to dust. And now this. The baby blinked slowly. Her tiny fist curled around a loop in his shirt. Her body trembled not from fear, but from chill. Ashes swirled in the wind like a dance of memory. He looked up. The fire had died down, consumed by its own hunger. In the distance, sirens approached. Flashing lights blinked like the end of a dream. He had to go, but not without her. Asher turned his silhouette framed by smoke and embers and strode toward his horse. He climbed on, cradling the baby to his chest with one arm, the other guiding Bishop down the ridge. Behind him, the wreckage crackled softly like a whisper, trying to die. As they galloped into the black, the baby cooed. Just once. A sound soft as dust. Asher looked down. The name came to him without thought, like it had always belonged to her. "Luz," he said, voice gravel in regret. He did not know then that the name meant light in Spanish. But somehow it fit. Under the low gray morning light, the Collins Ranch looked like a postcard sent from a forgotten war. The landscape was still the fields outside, bleached and barren, the windless air thick with frost. A light fog clung to the earth as if the past refused to lift. Inside the house, nothing had changed in years. The front door creaked open. Asher stepped in with the baby nestled awkwardly in the crook of one elbow. His other hand fumbled with the doorknob, trying to close it quietly. Luz stirred but didn't cry. She hadn't cried since he whispered her name hours ago, as if some small part of her miraculously understood that she was no longer alone. Asher moved slowly through the house, past the kitchen with its rusting appliances, and past the hallway lined with framed military commendations plaques that had once meant something now dull and untouched. He paused at the end of the hall. The door on the left. Closed. Untouched for 17 years. He turned the knob. It groaned like a wound reopening. Dust floated in the air as the door eased open. A girl's room frozen in time. A yellowed poster of a solar system on the wall. A bookcase sagging under the weight of novels and National Geographics. A twin bed neatly made with a faded quilt. He stepped in and stood for a moment holding Luz, as if her presence alone might crack the silence. On the nightstand was a photograph, his daughter Elise. 17, half-smiling, black hair tied in a braid, one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a young woman beside her, Maria. He picked up the photo with his free hand and stared. The glass was cracked, he didn't remember when. Maybe he had thrown something. Maybe it had just broken. He remembered the day Elise told him she wanted to adopt. The way her voice shook with hope. "She's from Chihuahua," Elise had said, her eyes lit with something he hadn't seen in years. "Her name's Isabella. She's 16 and she's got nobody. Just papers and bruises and a voice like a song." And he remembered what he said to her. What he didn't say. "You think you're going to save her? You think this makes you some kind of saint?" She died 2 months later. Drove into Stillwater Creek with the adoption application still in her car. Asher clenched the photo, then gently placed it face down on the table. He turned and laid Luz on the bed. Elise's bed. The baby stirred her tiny arms, stretching like she was claiming the space. He pulled the old quilt up around her, brushing away a toy bear that had turned gray with time. Then he stepped back, just a step, and he stayed there for hours. By noon, the baby had fallen into a deeper sleep. Asher had retreated to the porch, nursing a mug of black coffee gone cold. His hands were covered in old scars, but this morning they trembled in a way that had nothing to do with age. He didn't know how to feed a baby. Hadn't changed a diaper since Vietnam, when a nurse showed him how on a bed. Didn't have formula. Had no idea if Luz was sick, allergic to anything, or even fully human. She had come from the wreckage of hell after all. But she'd survived somehow. She had survived. He didn't know if he wanted her to. The gate creaked open. He looked up. A rusted pickup truck pulled into the drive. It was an old Ford, the kind you only saw in border towns and back roads now. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. Her hair was tied in a low knot, her jacket frayed at the cuffs. She moved with a careful slowness, as if measuring each step. Asher narrowed his eyes. Maria. He hadn't seen her in over a decade. She walked up to the porch, but didn't climb it. "I was driving to town," she said, voice rough from the cold. "Thought I'd stop. I wasn't sure if you still lived out here." He didn't answer. She looked at him, studied him. then tilted her head toward the house. I saw the light on in Elise's room. Still, he said nothing. I thought maybe it was a ghost, she added quietly. Asher finally spoke. It ain't. They stood in silence. Then, almost reluctantly, he gestured toward the door. You want coffee? She nodded once. Inside, Maria looked around the house with eyes that cataloged every crack and dust layer. She didn't comment. She didn't have to. She set her coat on a chair and walked slowly toward the hallway, pausing at the room on the left. Elise used to keep a blue journal, she said. Wrote poetry in it, half in Spanish, half in English. Always thought that was her way of making peace. Asher poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. He didn't offer milk or sugar. She was trying to adopt someone, Maria said suddenly. You remember that? He didn't respond. Her name was Isabella. That girl. She'd already been turned away by 3 families. But Elise, she didn't care. She said Isabella didn't need fixing. She needed belonging. I said it was a bad idea, Asher muttered. Maria turned toward him. You didn't just say it. You said she was being naive. You said she'd get used hurt, that people like Isabella weren't meant for families like yours. The words hung in the air like ash. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. More silence. Then Maria's eyes moved past him toward the hallway. Whose baby is that? Asher tensed. She stepped closer, staring into his face. I saw the news. That crash outside town. It was a smuggling rig. Dozens died, mostly migrants, some children. Asher looked away. Maria's voice was sharp now. Is she from that wreck? She was under a horse, he said quietly. Still breathing. Everything else was gone. Did you call anyone? His eyes flicked up. No. You know what they'll think. I don't care. Maria crossed her arms. You think keeping her here makes you her savior? He didn't flinch. But something in his eyes cracked. She didn't back down. Or is it guilt? Asher looked down at his hands, then at the cup. I don't know. Maria stepped forward, her voice softer now. Is this your redemption? A baby girl you didn't ask for, didn't plan for, but now you think maybe if you hold on tight enough, maybe she won't leave. Maybe she won't drive into the river. Asher said nothing. She's not Elise, Maria said, and she's not Isabella. I know, but you're looking at her like she's both. He swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. She needs help, Maria continued. Real help. Not a man with ghosts and a bottle of bourbon under his sink. Asher's eyes darkened. I can take care of her. Can you? The silence that followed was thick. Then Maria stepped toward the window, peering out at the field, where the firelight had once flickered. You know what the name Luce means? He didn't answer. It means light. Asher closed his eyes. Maria turned. You don't get to keep her because you feel sorry, or because you want a second chance. You keep her because you can give her something Elise never had. What's that? A father who learns how to stay. Asher turned away, jaw clenched, staring down the hallway toward Elise's room. Inside, Luce shifted beneath the old quilt. A small half-sigh escaped her lips. Not a cry, just breath. Maria stepped beside him. Her hand rested lightly on the doorframe. I'm not saying you shouldn't keep her, she said. I'm saying don't pretend it's something holy. It's messy. It's work. But maybe if you're willing, it can be love. Then she picked up her coat and walked to the door. Do you need anything, she asked. He shook his head. But as the door creaked open again, and Maria stepped into the cold, he spoke. Diapers? She paused. And formula, he added. Maria turned half smiling. I'll bring both tomorrow. The door shut behind her, soft as a closing chapter. And for the first time in years, Asher stood in the middle of that old house, not with ghosts, but with something like hope. Thin, fragile, unsure, but still breathing. Under the cold amber light of dawn, the wind swept across the Kansas prairie with a quiet whistle, soft like a lullaby, hummed by the dead. Dust skated low over the dried earth. The barn doors creaked not with protest, but as if stretching awake after years of silence. Asher stepped outside, holding Luce, the tiny girl wrapped in one of Elise's old flannel shirts. Sleeves rolled and tucked around her like a makeshift cocoon. The air bit his skin. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the frost still clung to the blades of grass like regret that refused to melt. He made his way past the chicken coop, past the weathered troughs, past the empty paddock gate that hadn't been latched since Elise stopped riding. His boots crunched the brittle ground, and every step seemed heavier than the last, not from fatigue, but from memory. Then he heard it. A soft rustle, a quiet snort. He turned. The horse, the same ash-gray Mustang from the wreckage, somehow alive, somehow standing, somehow following. Ash stood at the edge of the field, his silhouette framed by fog and light. The horse didn't move with wildness, but with intention. His coat still bore the scars of fire, dark patches where hair had scorched away. But in the dim light, the burns looked almost like war paint. Asher didn't speak. He just watched. Luce stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she looked up at him confused, and then turned toward the rustling noise. Her small fingers reached outward, grasping the cold air. The horse stepped forward slow and measured. Asher stood frozen. He hadn't let another living thing close to Luce since the night he found her. But now the horse approached each step, soft, deliberate, impossibly gentle for something so large. Ash lowered his head, his nostrils flaring, and came within a breath of the baby. Then it happened. Luce smiled. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't gas. It was something fuller, deeper. A knowing kind of smile. The kind of expression born from recognition of something ancient, perhaps even primal. Ash bent his head lower, and Luce reached up and touched the ridge of his muzzle with her open palm. Her tiny fingers pressed into the gray fur just above the burn mark. The horse didn't flinch. Asher felt something break inside him. Not violently, not all at once, but like an old ice dam giving way, crack by crack. He stood there until Luce fell asleep again. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. That night the wind howled louder than usual. It battered the windows like fists made of sky. Inside the house groaned with the strain of being inhabited again. Asher stood in front of Elise's bedroom door. It was closed. His hand trembled as it rose. Not from age, not from cold, but from the weight of 10 years. 10 years of not opening that door. 10 years of keeping the world outside it frozen in time. He placed his hand against the wood. The grain felt familiar. Elise had painted the door herself, sunflowers and stars. The colors had long since faded. He turned the knob. Inside the bed was empty. Luce now slept in the living room, cradled in the arms of a battered recliner, and watched over by a baby monitor that had once belonged to a neighbor's garage sale. He stepped inside. The air smelled of paper dust and something else. Something faded like perfume worn too long ago to remember its name. He stood in the center of the room, breathing in the silence. Then slowly, he began to move. He reached for the dresser and opened a drawer. Elise's journals, her blue ones. He picked one up, but didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward the closet. It was full clothes on hangers' shoes. In rows, her prom dress in a garment bag, with a tag still pinned to Elise. You shone like gold, Mom. A note written in a moment of pride before everything collapsed. He took a deep breath, and then with deliberate sacred hands, he began to pack. Fold by fold, shirt by shirt, drawer by drawer. Not to erase, but to release. By morning, the room was empty except for the bed, the desk and the photo of Elise and Maria, now restored, placed gently on the nightstand. Asher stood in the doorway, breathing slowly. Then he closed the door. Not slammed, not locked, just closed, and he didn't look back. The next day, he took a hammer and nails out to the barn. The roof had caved in years ago. The gate hung sideways from rusted hinges. Dust coated every beam, and a family of raccoons had long since claimed the loft. But it was still a barn, and it still stood. Asher nailed the gate straight, replaced the boards on the stall doors, ripped up the rotted hay, and laid fresh straw from the silo out back. He didn't say a word while he worked. His hands bled. Splinters dug deep. But he didn't flinch. He hadn't built anything in years, hadn't believed he could. And now here he was, rebuilding shelter for a horse that shouldn't have survived because a child that shouldn't exist had smiled. At one point, as he scrubbed rust off the water trough, a shadow fell across him. Ash stood in the doorway. The horse didn't step inside, not yet. He waited like he understood. Asher leaned against the post and motioned with his hand. Ash walked forward slow and heavy. His hooves clopped against the boards. He lowered his head and sniffed at the straw, then let out a breath, a deep, satisfied exhale. He was home. Asher stepped closer, reached for a brush. His hands hesitated. Then one stroke at a time, he began to comb the horse's matted fur. The bristles moved over soot, over burn scars, over old battle marks that told stories in a language only those who'd survived fire could understand. The hair came loose in clumps. But beneath it, new growth, coarse, soft, defiant. Asher kept brushing. The sun climbed the sky. The wind died down. And the old barn, once a mausoleum of memories, began to breathe again. Later that night, Luce babbled from her crib, half giggle, half gasp, as Ash stood outside the window, his face peering in with calm alertness. Inside, Asher watched them both. One inside, one outside, both impossibilities made real. He placed his palm against the glass, and for the first time, in as long as he could remember, he whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't clear who he was thanking, but maybe that wasn't the point. Under the heavy sun of a dry Kansas afternoon, the small gas station on the edge of Colton County sat like a fossil in the heat paint curling from its signage soda machines, humming in slow agony, and the faint smell of burnt oil clinging to the concrete like a memory. It was the kind of place no one stayed long, a pass through a mirage for men with nowhere to go. That's why the man stood out. He didn't pump gas, didn't buy snacks. He just leaned against a rusted Chevy, with no plates, chewing a toothpick and scanning every car that rolled in. His eyes were cold, distant, but alert. A hawk in jeans and leather. When he shifted to scratch his neck, the sun caught the underside of his forearm, and there it was. A tattoo, black, jagged, coiled like barbed wire and flame. A stylized serpent twisted around a torch, the symbol of Los Tizones, the cartel-backed trafficking ring that had been smuggling families through the southern corridor for over a decade. The same symbol Asher had seen once in a manila folder his daughter brought home back when she was still trying to adopt, back when she still believed systems could be reformed. The man with the tattoo asked the clerk something in Spanish. The clerk, nervous, shrugged. The man pointed east toward the hills, toward Asher's land. Then he got back into his truck and drove. Not fast, not urgent. Like a man who already knew exactly where he was going. That evening, the light turned gold. Asher was chopping wood behind the barn when he saw the dust trail rise beyond the ridge. A single vehicle, unmarked, crawling toward the road that led to his front gate. He felt the hairs on his neck rise, not from fear, but from instinct, the kind you don't unlearn. He went inside, locking the door behind him, and checked on Luz. She was asleep in the bassinet, curled beneath a blue blanket Maria had dropped off that morning. He watched her chest rise and fall, steady, peaceful. Then from the kitchen window, he saw Ethan's car pull into the driveway. Asher opened the door before the knock came. Ethan didn't smile. His face was pale. There was sweat along his temples, and his hands shook as he pulled a folded photo from his jacket pocket. This man was spotted at the Valero on Route 19, he said. A girl from the shelter I volunteer at recognized the tattoo. Asher took the photo. It was grainy, taken from a security cam, but the man's eyes were unmistakable. Ethan continued. He asked about a baby girl with a birthmark, a red flame. They call it La Marca del Fuego. It's how they brand the newborns they intend to sell. Asher didn't breathe. They know she's alive. Asher, Ethan whispered. They're coming. There was silence. Asher didn't ask how Ethan knew. He didn't ask how much time they had. He just looked past the young man, toward the shed, toward the open field and the horizon beyond. Then he nodded once. He didn't run. He moved. Inside, he packed quickly. Formula, bottles, a faded map. He slid a revolver into the satchel and laid loose into the carrier he'd fashioned from old flannel and belts. She didn't stir. Not even when he strapped her to his chest or when he laced the boots he hadn't worn since Afghanistan. Ethan hovered in the doorway. Where will you go? Asher didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. He was going wherever they wouldn't. Twilight bled into the sky like smoke. The barn was dark, but Ash stood ready, already pacing. Asher opened the gate. The horse stepped forward, letting the saddle fall against his back without a sound. It was as if the Mustang had been waiting. Ash had always been waiting. Asher climbed up, adjusted the wrap holding loose, and gave Ethan a last glance. No words, only a nod. Then he turned the horse toward the tree line and kicked into motion. And just like that, they were gone. The next 7 minutes of their escape would be scored only by silence and motion. No dialogue, just image. The sound of hoofbeats pounding against dry earth, beating out a rhythm older than language. The whisper of wind through tall grass. The sharp metallic creak of the saddle. The baby pressed against his chest, let out a small breath, not a cry, not a whimper. Just breath. Her tiny fingers curled against his collarbone. The sky above them cracked open wide and endless. And as they rode past the last fence post of the Collins Ranch, the camera caught a single detail. Asher's left hand, once curled into a permanent half-fist from injury, slowly unclenching against the reins. Not trembling, not anymore. Ahead of them, the black horizon. Behind them, fire. Under the hush of twilight, the world opened up. Asher guided Ash into the foothills of the Rockies, where the plains gave way to ridgelines that tore across the horizon like the ribs of the earth itself. The wind here was cleaner, colder too, and carried with it a kind of sacred stillness. It smelled of pine needles, old stone, and distance. A place that had forgotten men. They climbed slowly. Luz bound to Asher's chest in layers of wool and flannel, her breath warm against his collarbone. Her head bobbed gently with each of Ash's steps, and she made no sound except the occasional sigh, soft fluttering exhalations like a sparrow dreaming. That night, as the temperature dropped and stars blanketed the sky in piercing white, Asher found a cave. Not deep, not shelter in the biblical sense, but enough a divot in the side of the mountain, shielded by boulders and old pine roots. He slid off Ash's knees, aching, and carried Luz inside. There beneath the low overhang, he made a fire from driftwood and pine needles. He held Luz close, wrapped in his old marine issue coat, the one with Elise's name sewn into the lining after a 4th of July parade 20 years ago. He tucked it around the baby and leaned against the wall. Ash stood just outside the mouth of the cave, his silhouette still and strong against the flickering light. He didn't graze, didn't lie down, just watched. Eyes sharp, ears twitching at every distant crack of the trees. Inside the cave, Luce began to stir, her face twisted, lips puckering in silent discomfort. Asher froze, unsure. Then Ash stepped forward, his head ducking beneath the rock lip. Slowly, he extended his nose toward the bundle in Asher's arms. The horse's breath, warm, rhythmic, caressed Luce's cheek. She relaxed instantly, her tiny hands loosening face, melting into calm. Ash withdrew. Asher looked at the animal. Their eyes met. For a long moment, man and horse stared into each other. Not with fear or uncertainty, but something older. Something forged in the trenches of experience of loss. Something unspoken, and yet entirely understood. Asher gave a single nod. Ash held his gaze, then turned back toward the dark. Luce slept. The fire crackled its warmth, uneven, chasing shadows across the stone walls. Asher leaned his head back, letting the cold rock press against his skull. His body ached, but that wasn't new. What was new was the silence inside his chest. The constant hum of guilt that had once gnawed at the edges of his mind had quieted, if only for now. But silence wasn't always peace, because when sleep finally came, it didn't come empty. It came with memory. It was a dry season in Guerrero. He was 25, a corporal with a bad knee and a rifle that never jammed. They'd been told it was a village harboring insurgents, families loyal to the cartel, some twisted mixture of guerrilla and ghost. Orders came down fast. Flush it out. Torch what you can't clear. He remembered the faces, children pulling their siblings behind doorways. A man raising his hand speaking in Spanish Asher didn't understand. Women screaming into dirt. He remembered the smoke and the fire, and the way his hands didn't shake until later, until the night he sat alone cleaning his rifle and realized his boot print had been burned into a little girl's doll. He never told Elise. She asked once why he woke up screaming. He said it was the heat. Asher sat up in the cave, breath sharp in his chest. The fire had burned low now, just glowing embers. Rain began to fall outside, slow, gentle at first, then harder, drumming against the stones like a warning. Ash stood motionless, drenched but unfazed, his mane darkened to slate. Asher looked down at Luce. She was dry, warm, still sleeping. His hands cupped her head. Her skin was soft, unscarred, unruined. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he cried. Not loudly, not with sobs or wailing, but with quiet, relentless tears that slid down the lines of his face like rain over canyons. The kind of crying that didn't seek witness or forgiveness. The kind that just was. It wasn't a moment of redemption. It was a reckoning. A man surrounded by stone and night, and all he had left weeping, not for what he'd done, but for what had been done in his name. For the ghosts he'd buried under orders and silence. For the girl who died trying to save a child. For a daughter. For a village. For a baby now asleep in his arms. He cried. The rain fell harder. Ash stepped closer to the cave mouth, blocking the wind. The fire flickered, casting light on 3 forms, man, child, and horse, huddled against the cold. And the mountain kept their secret. Dawn had not yet broken when death came riding through the trees. The air was still almost sacred in its hush, the first hints of gray whispering over the mountaintops. Inside the cave, Asher slept with his back against the stone, his arms cradling Luce close to his chest. Her tiny hand rested on his collarbone, warm and fragile, like the memory of something that should have never survived. Outside, Ash stood motionless, ears twitching. The Mustang had not closed his eyes all night. Then snap, not a twig, a breath. Ash turned his head slowly, muscles tense. The wind shifted. A scent of presence, something wrong. From the ridge above, the first man crept through the brush. Then another. Black jackets low to the ground. Rifles slung, low knives at the ready. The lost Tizone's crew didn't speak. They didn't need to. They'd tracked prey before. Below them, the horse watched. The first footstep fell on gravel. Ash moved. His hooves struck the stone with a sound like a war drum. He charged the first attacker before the man could shout, driving full force into his chest. The man slammed backward against the wall of the cave, spine snapping like dry kindling. The gun clattered to the ground. Inside, Luce stirred. Asher blinked awake. Then he heard it, the scream. Not human. Not quite. Ash was already lunging for the second man, teeth snapping inches from a blade. Blood sprayed from a gash along the Mustang's flank, but he didn't flinch. He pivoted on one rear leg, lifted and kicked. The sickening crunch of bone against hoof echoed through the trees. Asher grabbed the revolver from his satchel and pulled Luce against his chest. She whimpered a soft, confused cry. More footsteps now, 2, 3, descending through the brush. The air filled with shouting, then gunfire. Ash reared his silhouette flashing against the pale gray sky. His body twisted with the grace of something feral divine. A bullet grazed his shoulder. Another slammed into his side. Still he moved. He positioned himself in front of the cave's opening between the bullets and the child. And then came the third shot, a low hit behind the ribs. Ash staggered. His knees buckled, but he didn't fall. Instead, he turned his head toward Asher, eyes wide, not with fear, but with something older. Something final. Their eyes met. Asher's voice caught in his throat. The fourth shot rang out. Slow motion. The camera captured Ash's eyes as he turned one last time toward Luce. She was crying now. Ash's head dipped. His muzzle brushed her forehead just a graze. Just enough. Then he turned again and charged. One last time. He collided with the man holding the rifle, sending them both sprawling into the dirt. Ash didn't get back up. Asher fired, not to kill, but close. The crack of the revolvers shattered the morning. The attackers hesitated, ducking behind trees. One screamed in Spanish, another cursed in English. Confusion spread. Asher used it. He wrapped Luce tighter, slung the bag over one shoulder, and ran. Over rocks, through brush, slipping in mud. His legs burned. His breath came in sharp bursts. Luce cried louder now, clinging to his shirt with tiny fists. Behind them, Ash didn't move. Asher didn't look back. Not yet. They ran until they reached the tree line, until the sounds of boots and bullets faded behind the mountain's curve. Then Asher stopped. He turned. Ash lay in the clearing, breathing, barely. Blood soaked the earth beneath him, turning the moss into something dark and holy. His chest rose once, then again, slower. Asher stepped forward, Luce tucked tight. He dropped to his knees beside the horse. Ash lifted his head an inch, just enough to meet Asher's eyes. His breathing was shallow now, uneven. Each exhale a whisper. Asher reached out. Ash moved first. The horse's muzzle nudged Asher's hand, slow, deliberate trembling. Then one breath, one blink, gone. Ash's eyes stared upward, but they didn't see anymore. Asher didn't move. Luce had gone quiet in his arms, sensing something ancient and irreversible. Asher placed a hand on Ash's neck. The body was still warm. Steam rose from the blood as it met the morning air. He closed the horse's eyes with trembling fingers. Then, without a word, he stood. He took one last look at the body, the broken shield that had stood between death and the child. He pressed his lips to Luce's forehead, and he kept walking. The tires rolled over cracked asphalt as the city crept into view, gray and humming beneath an overcast sky. Wichita wasn't much, just a scatter of buildings pressed flat against the prairie, but to Asher it looked like another world, a place full of noise, motion, and strangers. But he wasn't here for sanctuary. He was here for exposure. The sign read, La Voz del Corazón, Independent Latin News and Culture. The building was tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. A neon open flickered uncertainly in the window. Inside, rows of desks were piled high with printouts, protest flyers, empty coffee cups. Phones rang. A single wall held dozens of photos, migrant camps, farm workers' protests, missing children. Asher stepped through the door holding Luce. No one noticed at first. Then a woman looked up, young, maybe 27. Freckles, gold hoops, black eyeliner smudged from long hours. Her eyes fell on the child, then on the man, then the blood. His jeans were still stained with Ash's last sacrifice. The child's blanket smelled faintly of pine and sweat. The woman stood. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice cautious. "I need to tell you something." Asher rasped. "I need the world to hear it." She hesitated, then motioned him into a glass office. Her name was Kamala Reyes, a second-generation Mexican-American journalist who'd spent the last 3 years trying to prove that the state was quietly deporting orphaned children rescued from trafficking rings, declaring them undocumented cargo, and shipping them back into the very hells they'd been pulled from. She hit record on her phone, and Asher spoke. He told her everything, from the night of the crash, to the cry in the smoke, to Ash's eyes before dying, to the village in Mexico he helped destroy, to the baby on his chest, with fire on her skin and peace in her breath. Camilla didn't interrupt once. Her pen moved across the page in bursts, but her eyes never left his. When he finished, he held up the photograph. Ash in front of the barn, Luce touching his muzzle. The last picture Ethan had taken before the chase began. "I want people to know," Asher said. "I want them to know what he did." Camilla's jaw clenched. She stared at the photo for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I'll write it," she said. "But I won't sugarcoat it. I'm not asking you to." She stood. "Wait here." 3 hours later, the story was live. Veteran rescues trafficked infant wild Mustang dies, protecting them in Kansas mountains. It went viral in under 20 minutes. Photos flashed across timelines, Ash bleeding into the grass, Luce asleep in Asher's arms, the horse's eyes. Camilla wrote like a flame. He didn't find the child. He found himself. And then he gave everything to make sure she could live. The Latinx community exploded. Thousands shared the article with hashtags #JusticeForLuz, #Ash the Protector, This is America Too. An advocacy group posted the headline beside a photo of their own missing infants. A video compilation of Ash running across a field to Luz's giggle went viral. Music artists began sampling Camilla's line, "The horse gave his body. The man gave his past. The child gave them purpose." Then the protest began. In Denver, dozens marched outside the IC detention center, carrying signs that read, "They are not cargo. No more silent children. Ash died for her. Let her stay." In Houston, a mural of Ash appeared overnight, wings rising from his burn-scarred back, Luz held beneath him. In Los Angeles, candles were lit for Ash, for Luz, for Elise, and Asher watched all of it unfold through the window of a diner across from the federal courthouse. He sat at a booth, Luz sleeping on his lap. Camilla beside him, her laptop open, news alerts pinging nonstop. "You're trending in 3 languages, she said quietly. And the DHS just released a statement denying everything. Asher didn't reply. His eyes were on the door. Across the street, 2 officers stood waiting. Not threatening, not smiling, just waiting. "You don't have to do this," Camilla said. "I do. You saved her. I endangered her by staying." She looked down. Asher gently lifted Luz, kissed her forehead. "She needs something I can't give." "Like what?" "A future." Camilla reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. "A legal notice. There's a couple from New Mexico. They run a rescue ranch for injured horses. They've been trying to adopt for years. They saw the story. They're already driving here." Asher nodded once. "Good." He stood. Outside, camera crews were already gathering. Reporters, activists, strangers holding signs with Ash's name. Asher stepped through the door and walked slowly down the courthouse steps, Luz cradled in his arms. The crowd parted. Flashbulbs popped. Microphones rose. Voices shouted questions. "Mr. Collins, do you regret taking her? Do you think the government will charge you? What does this child mean to you?" Asher said nothing. His boots touched concrete. He turned to the nearest camera, and then quietly held up the photo of Ash. A hush fell, and into that hush he said just once, he gave his life for her. Then he turned himself in. The courthouse buzzed like a hornet's nest before the storm. Rows of reporters packed the gallery. Activists sat with signs folded across their laps. Every seat was filled. Outside, crowds spilled onto the lawn, holding banners bearing Ash's face. Luz's name, Elise's photo. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside, Asher sat at the defense table in a dark suit 2 sizes too large, borrowed from a pastor who didn't ask questions. He looked smaller now, not older, just stripped. Hollowed and clear-eyed, as if he had finally shed everything that once weighed him down. Luz wasn't in the room. She was down the hall, in a playroom supervised by social services. He hadn't seen her in 24 hours. And his hands wouldn't stop trembling. Across the aisle, the state of Kansas for Asher Collins unfolded like something too sacred to interrupt. The prosecution was fast. The assistant DA, young, polished, ambitious, spoke of the law, of borders and custody, of how even good intentions could still violate the Uniform Child Protection Act. He took a child, she said, across multiple state lines. He did not notify law enforcement. He did not report a live infant in a federal crime scene. That's concealment. That's obstruction. That's endangerment. She turned to the judge. Mr. Collins acted unilaterally. He made himself judge, jury, and savior. But we are a nation of law, not sentiment. Silence. The judge, an older black woman with steel-gray braids and a face carved by years of impossible decisions, nodded, but said nothing. Then Maria took the stand. She wore black. No jewelry. Just a crucifix that had once belonged to her mother. "I worked for the Collins family for 5 years, she said. Elise was like my sister." She held up a photograph, Elise, in a field holding a baby that never came. "She tried to adopt a little girl from Oaxaca," Maria said, voice cracking. "But the agency refused. They said the culture match wasn't appropriate. That Elise wasn't Latin enough to raise a Mexican child. That she might confuse the child's identity." Maria looked at Asher, and for a moment her jaw tightened. "She died 6 months later. The courtroom didn't breathe. I hated him for a long time," Maria continued. "Because he didn't fight for her. Because he let the world tell her no. But then I saw what he did for Luz." She paused. "He gave her what Elise never got the right to belong to someone who loved her. He crossed 1,000 miles, carried her through mountains, bled beside a horse who shielded her with his body." Maria wiped her eyes. "This wasn't a crime. It was a resurrection." Gasps, a rustle of tears. Then Ethan stepped forward. Jeans, denim jacket, no tie. "I met Mr. Collins at the VFW 5 years ago," he said. "He never talked much, but you could tell. He carried something heavy. He looked toward the jury. People say he broke the law. Maybe he did. But laws don't always catch the people they're supposed to. He pulled out a folder. This is a report I submitted last year about a trafficking ring operating in Wichita. The same one that burned in that wreck. He tossed it on the table. No one listened. But Mr. Collins did more than listen, he acted. He held up a photo of Ash. I watched a dying horse protect that child. Like it understood exactly what she meant. And I watched this man give up everything. Not just his home, but his shame, his silence for a girl who didn't even know his name yet. He stepped down. The courtroom didn't clap, but something shifted. Then the judge spoke. She began with the facts, the violations, the codes. Then she paused. The question before this court is not whether Mr. Collins violated technical protocols, she said. The question is whether he acted with intent to harm or intent to protect. She looked directly at Asher. Mr. Collins, your past doesn't vanish because of one act. But neither should your act be ignored because of your past. A long silence. On the charge of unlawful concealment of a minor, this court finds you not guilty. A breath broke across the room like wind over glass. On the question of custody, the child known as Luz will be placed with a family vetted by the court, a Mexican-American couple with experience in both trauma care and cultural preservation. A soft gasp, a murmur of hope. Asher lowered his head. Then the judge added, Mr. Collins, while you will not retain custody, this court grants you monthly supervised visitation at the discretion of the guardians. He didn't lift his face. He only whispered, thank you. After the verdict, the crowd poured out. Journalists shoved microphones. Protesters wept. Camilla stood at the back recording every frame, but Asher didn't hear any of it. He sat on a bench outside the courthouse, hands folded in his lap. No smile, just stillness. Then small footsteps. He looked up, and there she was, Luz, wearing a tiny pink jacket, her hair braided in a loose crown. She was holding a teddy bear too big for her arms. One of the new guardians stood behind her, unsure. Asher stood slowly. Luz stared at him. Then, like lightning through fog, she lifted her hand and pointed. Asher. The name didn't come as a question. It came like a memory. He sank to one knee. She walked to him. He opened his arms. She stepped in. Not long, not tight. Just enough. Enough for him to close his eyes and whisper, I hear you. And the world kept spinning. The wind had changed in Kansas. Not the kind that blew through fields and bent fence posts, but the kind that softened hearts, that rearranged the weight of memory. It was early spring 1 year later. The morning sun spilled over the horizon like a whisper. No fanfare, no sound, just warmth unfurling across acres of reborn earth. What was once brittle grass and old ash now shimmered green with young clover and prairie bloom. The fields around Asher's ranch breathed again. The old barn had been restored. Fresh cedar repainted red. A new roof, a new purpose. Inside it echoed with laughter. 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls, all under 10. All from migrant families who had found shelter in the Midwest, were saddled on small horses clumsily gripping reins, with excitement buzzing through their tiny limbs. And there in the center of the corral stood Asher. His posture was looser now. Still upright, but no longer rigid. He wore a sun-faded flannel shirt, sleeves rolled old boots caked with fresh dust. His eyes, once like cracked glass, now held color. Color and something harder to name, peace maybe, or simply space. He whistled low and steady, guiding a boy named Tomas to ease back his heels. That's it, Asher called, voice calm. Talk to her with your legs, not your hands. Thomas grinned, swaying a little too far to the right. From the fence, Maria laughed. She's going to toss him, only if he forgets to breathe. The children circled once more. Beyond the barn, under the only tree that had survived both the fire and the years, a small bronze statue rested atop a stone base. A horse head bowed mid-stride, carved in remarkable detail. Its eyes faced east, toward the clearing where Ash had taken his last breath. On the plaque, beneath 4 simple words, From Ash We Bloom. Inside the house, a small pair of boots padded across wood floors. Luce, now 3 and fierce, walked with the confident bounce of a child who had been loved into strength. Her hair was pulled into 2 wild braids, one tighter than the other. A pink bandana hung from her neck. She held a tiny helmet in one hand, dragging a stuffed animal in the other. Maria helped zip her coat. You sure you don't want juice first? No, Luce said. I go now. Maria opened the screen door. The wind picked up. Luce ran, feet pounding the dirt, cheeks flushed with purpose. Asher saw her from across the yard and stopped mid-sentence. Everything slowed. The children quieted. Luce ducked under the fence with a familiar ease and beeline toward the smallest horse in the corral. A yearling born the previous summer, still shy, still learning. Its name was Brisa, the Spanish word for breeze. Asher had named it the day Luce first laughed again after Ash's death. She walked straight to Brisa, held out her hand, palm up. The horse stepped forward. They touched. Then Luce looked over her shoulder at Asher. Her lips parted. The wind caught her voice and lifted it clear and bright across the pasture. Oh, why? Time paused. The children stared. Maria covered her mouth. Asher stood perfectly still, and then his eyes watered. Just enough. Not the tears of grief. Not even gratitude, but something older. Recognition. Brisa nudged Luce's shoulder, and the child giggled. She climbed the saddle with a confidence that hadn't existed last year. Asher stepped forward, but didn't intervene. She didn't need help now. She was riding, alive, breathing, carried not by Ash, but by what Ash had made possible. She looped the corral, once holding the horns swaying with the rhythm of hooves. The children clapped. Asher didn't move. Luce turned again, eyes shining. Con Yente Roy, she said, half English, half Vietnamese, an echo of stories Maria had told her in both tongues. Asher smiled. He didn't need a translation. That evening, after the lessons ended and the kids were picked up, Asher stayed behind. He walked alone to the statue. The light was fading. The bronze shimmered in the dusk, glowing as if warmed from within. He crouched, ran his fingers along the name again. From ash we bloom. Not just a tribute, a truth. He sat beneath the tree, leaned back, closed his eyes. And for the first time in decades, he heard silence, not as punishment, but as peace. The field had changed. A year ago, it was only scorched earth. Blackened roots, broken branches, the faint scent of smoke still clinging to the wind. The place where a truck had burned, where a horse had bled, where a child had cried into a man's chest beneath a sky too vast to notice. Now the field breathed again. Children's laughter bounced through the warm Kansas air. Bright canopies fluttered above picnic tables. Painted wooden signs pointed the way toward different corners: arts and storytelling, healing garden, equine therapy, family legal aid. It wasn't perfect. It didn't pretend to be, but it was alive. At the front gate stood a newly installed metal arch. Welded vines twisted across its length, and in the center, bold lettering declared, Ash and Lou's Center for Immigrant Child Renewal. From the ashes, hope rises. Visitors came from all over. Teachers, parents, lawmakers, skeptics. Some to volunteer, some to observe, some to grieve. All of them left changed. Inside, a group of children sat beneath a cottonwood tree legs, crossed eyes wide as Maria read from a bilingual picture book. Her voice moved gently between English and Spanish, never pausing to explain, letting the language roll like rivers side by side. She wore a sunflower brooch on her chest. On her left wrist, a tattoo. Ash. Below it in smaller ink, he stood when no one else did. Behind her stood the main building, a long, low structure, made of reclaimed barnwood and salvaged stone. Its roof sloped into the land, shaped like the wing of a mustang mid-turn. In one classroom, Ethan paced slowly across the front, chalk in one hand, a group of teenagers watching with furrowed brows. The board behind him read, Moral Courage versus Legal Authority. He tapped it once. Sometimes you do the right thing, he said. And the world tells you it's wrong. A kid raised his hand. But if you break the law, doesn't that make you a criminal? Ethan smiled. Depends who writes the law. The kids leaned in. Near the back, where the trees got thicker and the sunlight broke in dapples, stood a small wooden amphitheater. Simple benches, a low stage. Nothing fancy. Nothing. It was here that the children danced. Every Saturday afternoon, the community gathered for performances, music, storytelling, dance. Today it was a spring recital. Asher sat at the very back row, arms crossed gently over his chest, eyes fixed on the stage. He was older now, slower, but not diminished. Beside him, Camilla whispered, You're going to cry. He said nothing. On stage, Luce stepped into the light. She wore a soft gray dress and a ribbon in her hair. Her movements were careful, deliberate. Her bare feet touched the stage like feathers, like petals. The music rose, slow at first, strings, then piano. The other children joined, surrounding her in a circle. Luce moved through them like a heartbeat. And then she raised her hands, palms upward, and let them fall like ash. The other children followed, mimicking the gesture. Ash to light, pain to movement, wound to breath. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was true. And as the music slowed and the final pose held, the crowd stood. Asher didn't. He just looked. His eyes welled. But it wasn't the dance. It was the wind. A soft gust swept across the stage, picking up dust from the nearby field. A scattering of gray, the faintest trace of ash still buried deep in the roots of this land. It twirled upward, circled once, and vanished into the sky. Camilla leaned over. You okay? Asher nodded, slow. She's home, he said. Pa. Later, as dusk painted the horizon in deep gold, Asher walked alone through the field. The far end had been left wild, unmown, untouched. Not for neglect, but for reverence. At the very center stood a stone ring no more than 2 feet tall. Inside it, a single prairie rose bush bloomed burnt red petals against dark green. A bronze plaque lay at its base, to Ash, who carried more than a child, who taught us that love isn't spoken. It stood for. Asher crouched. His knees cracked. He didn't mind. He reached out and let his fingers graze the earth. Warm, new, then small footsteps behind him. He turned. Lou stood a few paces away, still in her gray dress, barefoot now. She carried a tiny jar. Seeds, she said softly. For what? For more. She stepped beside him and tipped the jar. Tiny wildflower seeds spilled into the soil. He smiled. She looked at him. You think Ash can see? He didn't answer right away. Then, I think he is this. She nodded, satisfied. Then she took his hand. They sat in silence, watching the sky fade. The lights from the center glowed behind them. Children's laughter echoed in the distance. And the wind, soft, steady, full of memory, rose once more across the field of ash.